Enkidu, Gilgamesh, and monster fucking. Before we get to the monster fucking, here defined for our purposes as willing sexual contact with a non-human entity, I think it's important to note that the Epic of Gilgamesh we're all familiar with is a work of an expanded universe. It is important to note that what we have of the Gilgamesh epic is itself a collection of stories, history, and mythology that slowly coagulated together from disparate sources and genres. What I mean by that is that the oldest heroic epic was formed according to thousands of years of cultural osmosis, mutation, and variations before becoming a classic story. To put it plainly, Gilgamesh was Dracula and Superman kind of all rolled up into one, culturally, religiously, and historically, and he cemented this central status by being the subject of countless lesser-known tales. Gilgamesh began as a historical figure, a king and defender of the city of Uruk. The stories about him split into two paths, according to scholar Thorkild Jacobsen, literary and non-literary, historical and religious. Gilgamesh as a heroic ancestor contrasts starkly with our sort of traditional view of Gilgamesh as a manly man, with the tale of Gilgamesh and the underworld. In this story, to condense it down quite a bit, Gilgamesh makes himself such a nuisance with his stick and ball that the people of Uruk throw his sporting gear into the underworld. So, naturally, he sends Enkidu to retrieve it, along with specific instructions on what not to do in the underworld. This has predictably tragic results. These different portraits of Gilgamesh congeal together into a coherent narrative while borrowing from other folktales. Jacobsen asserts that elements like Utnapishtim, the flood, the wild man, and the quest for life stories that are key parts of the modern Gilgamesh canon or tale were grafted onto the final production and have their origins outside of the library of Ashurbanipal. My premise here is that monster fucking, as defined earlier, is not inherently culturally synthetic, but that greater familiarity with the figure doing it seems to encourage that sort of thing. Dracula and the Wolfman in more recent history are synthetic characters, showing up everywhere across genres, and are vaguely, or explicitly, erotic. You fuck what you know. And what's more familiar than gods and monsters? Now let's begin. Gilgamesh himself is arguably a product of monster fucking. His father, Lugalbanda, smashed his mother, who was the wild cow goddess Ninsun. Kings having sex with the gods was more common than not in this part of mythology, as was a deep and abiding terror of the pantheon. To quote Terry Pratchett, the difference between gods and demons is about the same as the differences between freedom fighters and terrorists. One of the great things about being the son of a cow goddess is that Gilgamesh is constantly compared to a bull or a cow with descriptors in the text of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Accordingly, as the son of the cow goddess, Gilgamesh's over-the-top physicality and proportions get a whole lot of cow and bull comparisons, up to and including puns. For that alone, I love Mesopotamian literature. Let's be honest here. Here's an example of that. From the text. Surpassing all kings, for his stature renowned, heroic offspring of Uruk, a wild charging bull, wild calf of divine Lugalbanda, Gilgamesh is perfect in strength. Suckling of the sublime, wild cow, divine Ninsun, towering Gilgamesh is uncannily perfect. Not only is Gilgamesh the two-thirds god descendant of a wild cow, but he is the king of Uruk, which seems to be a constant in all of his stories. And he is a nightmare of a king for his subjects. He has a sort of monstrous energy for every kind of distraction. He wears the men out with sports and wrestling and constant challenges, and sexually assaults newly married women on their wedding night, saying this is his right as king, obviously. This is a monster, part divine, part human, behaving like one. Nobody is able to stop Gilgamesh from doing exactly what he wants. A few examples from the text. Gilgamesh could wrestle with 50 companions, wearing out young men every day. He kept the young men of Uruk fearful of mistreatment. And Gilgamesh would leave no young woman to her husband. He was their bull, they were the kine. Their bitter clamor rose to the sky. The warrior's daughter, the young man's chosen, Ishtar kept hearing their plaints. The people of Uruk complain to the gods so much that they create a match for him, custom made out of clay, Enkidu. Enkidu wasn't born, but created, covered in hair, muscular and at home with the wild animals of the steppe, with whom he had an affinity. He frees them from traps set by hunters and, grazes with them, hangs out. This annoys and terrifies the local hunters who write to Uruk to ask what to do. They can't even touch Enkidu. Here's a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh describing what it's like to even see Enkidu. A hunter, a trapping man, encountered him, Enkidu, at the waterhole. One day, a second and a third, he encountered him at the waterhole. When he saw him, the hunter was stock still with terror. The hunter was aghast, struck dumb. Gilgamesh replies by sending a temple prostitute, Shamhat, to the steppes, the logic being that if she seduces him, Enkidu will lose his affinity and ability to empathize with animals and become less formidable. Shamhat presents herself to Enkidu. He accepts, and they bone for 6 days and 7 nights straight, a number that is repeated through the epic. In this case, the monster fucking was done by Shamhat to a very willing Enkidu. And in the very real way, this made Enkidu human as the Mesopotamian civilizations would understand it, i.e. wearing clothes, drinking wine, that sort of thing. Here's a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh describing that. Shamhat loosed her garments, she opened her loins, he took her charms, she was not bashful, she took his vitality. She tossed aside her clothing, and he lay upon her. She treated him, a human, to woman's work. As in his ardor, he caressed her. 6 days, 7 nights was Enkidu aroused, flowing into Shamhat. Well, when the post-coital bliss wears off, Enkidu finds that the animals won't accept him back. So he dresses like a man, gets wildly drunk with the hunters and traders he once terrified. In one source, he and Shamhat go at it again for another 6 days and 7 nights, before taking him to Uruk, where Shamhat has suggested that he meet Gilgamesh. Enkidu eagerly accepts his invitation. Back in Uruk, Gilgamesh is beset by dreams. Unpleasant dreams, which is weird because nothing bad ever happens to Gilgamesh ever. Gilgamesh is confused by his dreams and goes to his mother, the wild cow goddess Ninsun, to ask what the dreams mean. Here's a sample of what he tells her. Mother, I had a second dream. An axe was cast down in a street of broad-marted Uruk. They were crowding around it. The whole of Uruk was standing around it. The people were crowding around it. A throng was jostling towards it. Young men were mobbed about it. I carried it off and laid it down beside you. I fell in love with it like a woman. I caressed it. Then you were making it my partner. Ninsun tells Gilgamesh that this dream of an axe, a falling star, meant that a wild man is going to come challenge him, and that they will be best friends and partners. A quote from the text. The wild cow Ninsun, knowing and wise, who understood everything, said to Gilgamesh, "The stars of heaven around you, as the force of heaven fell upon you, you're trying to move but being unable to budget. You're laying it down before me and then making it your partner. You're falling in love with it like a woman. You're caressing it. It means there will come a strong one, a companion who rescues a friend. He will be mighty in the land. Strength will be his. Like a force of heaven, so mighty will be his strength. You will fall in love with him like a woman. You will caress him. He will be mighty and rescue you time and again." Gilgamesh is very excited by this, but not so excited that he stops harassing newly married women. It is in this act of violence that Enkidu finds him and prevents him from proceeding further. The two fight so hard that they shatter door frames, and the result is unclear. It's either a tie or Gilgamesh just barely gets a win. Nevertheless, the wild hairy man is something Gilgamesh has never seen before, an equal in strength, and they immediately become best friends / lovers. This can be seen as monster fucking any way you look at it. Either the newly humanized hairy wild man from the steppes is redeeming the divinely powered king with the power of romance and adventure, or the despot is yielding before the irresistible charms of the hairy messenger of the gods. In any event, Gilgamesh and Enkidu become inseparable, and Gilgamesh learns loss and humility through their adventures, peaking with Enkidu's death from a sickness. These adventures and the implication for my hypothesis lie beyond the time limit of this presentation, save for this very brief summary. Enkidu's death drives Gilgamesh to dress as his old friend and wander the wastes far from Uruk, looking for a way to avoid death. Through his friendship and possibly erotic relationship with Enkidu, Gilgamesh has become more human than monster, and never more so when, after all his efforts, he accepts his mortality and weakness.
All right, so how do we go from the Epic of Gilgamesh to modern sexy monsters? Well, first off, I guess there's probably a need to prove that there are modern sexy monsters, which I would say all you really need to do is look at The Shape of Water to believe that. It's probably one of the more famous current examples of like sexy monster out there, but it's probably important to define what we mean by monster first. So, for the context of this, we kind of decided that monster was going to be anything that isn't explicitly human, or is in some way sort of a type of other. We included aliens in this list. Um, they're not always classically monsters, but the line gets a little bit fuzzy. So let's think about aliens for a second. So aliens have been considered, sexy since as far back as like John Carter of Mars. Those aliens were humanoid, so it was probably a little bit less weird for a reader, but they're still aliens, and he was still, creating a whole life and having sex with them. And you get that all the way up into the modern day with things like Star Trek, where you've got Gala, the Orion, who's not only sexy, but literally has sex with the main character on screen. And you can see sort of how this expanded universe is developing toward everything monstrous is becoming sexier as modern media progresses. You've also got other texts like Kindred by Octavia Butler, where aliens and humans reproduce, but not via explicit sex. So it still seems worth mentioning because this was along the path of aliens becoming sexy. And then you get something like Venom, which again has no explicit sex. However, if you've seen the trailer for the new Venom movie, no spoilers, I promise, um, it shows a high level of domesticity between the alien counterpart and Eddie Brock, the human counterpart. And even just showing this domesticity is an example of an alien becoming more human via proximity and relationship with a human. So, my main idea in this is, why do we enjoy the idea of a relationship with the other? Is it, as people classically think, that there is an inherent exoticism to that which is other to us? Or is it to make the other seem more familiar and less frightening? Which I would point out doesn't necessitate that eroticism doesn't exist, but does instead find eroticism as a way to make something accessible to human nature. So, for more examples of this, one can look at something like werewolves and vampires, probably the most classic example of sexy monsters. So, whereas the original stories of having sex with werewolves and other vampires, etc., were doubtless fueled by classism and excuses to reframe sexual assault, and in no way do I want to take away from that. There, there's a more modern iteration that is very far from this theme. So instead of having sex with a monster, making a person more monstrous, which would be the sexual assault kind of scenario, you instead get that having sex with a monster now makes the monster more human. For example, in a plotline on early on in MTV's Teen Wolf, the main character, who is a newly turned werewolf and often struggles with feeling disconnected from his humanity, has sex with his human girlfriend. Soon after solidifying their relationship, she becomes his anchor to his humanity. In turn, she is often portrayed as monstrous humanity when they're not dating, and she falls back into her hunter family's legacy, a role reversal that is more and more common in this kind of media. Additionally, absolutely welcoming the groans that no doubt this will inspire. One only has to think of sparkly vampires to understand the trend toward sexy monster becoming more human through a human's love. But this isn't limited to the sparkly vampires. You can consider the CW television show The Vampire Diaries, in which a plotline of the first season is how falling in love with a human makes the supposedly evil vampire sympathetic and a good person. Casting back further, one can see the origins of this idea in Buffy the Vampire Slayer's Spike character, where falling in love with Buffy made him act like a good person, where good here means abiding by standard human morals. And lastly, one can see this influence even beyond popular culture and just in everyday life now. You only need to consider the shifting legacy of Bigfoot or Mothman, such as people who go to Point Pleasant specifically to touch the Mothman statue's butt, or the plethora of sexy Bigfoot shirts and bumper stickers that exist. So, my main question here is what makes the idea of romancing monsters so appealing? Is it that we're drawn to that which is other as a form of escapism, or is it the idea that the other can be made recognizable if only one gives it the opportunity for empathy and understanding? To quote Caitlin Seal's now internet famous poetry snippet, one is a monster, not a monster. Why, when you love it, of course. This was true of Gilgamesh when he loved Enkidu enough to learn how to be, as my companion says, more human than monster, the common theme that has underlied monster romances since the beginning of recorded epics. So, from Gilgamesh to modern day sparkly vampires, how did we get here? We get here by understanding that cultural mythos is collaborative. We build on what came before us. The work of Gilgamesh was an expanded universe, and one only has to watch vampires shift from Dracula to Twilight to understand how even a few short centuries can drastically change and adapt well loved stories and mythos into something similar but unrecognizable without the same key elements. But at the core of this is an attempt to make the unfamiliar familiar, to acknowledge the monstrousness of humanity at times, but also the potential for good in that which is not fully human.